Thank you for coming along. It's a much smaller than a normal sort of design-in, but I think it's actually a better approach this way. It's a little bit more intimate. It's like you feel like an acoustic set or something like that. Outside the box is really, we're just trying to look at basically design-focused hotels, and by nature they're boutique hotels. But we're going to try and sort of get some different points of view here. And I think, as Howard said, I think in a smaller venue like this, it would be good if somebody has a question that seems like it's the right time to ask it, then please do. I mean, we can probably hear you from here. You don't have to get a mic. Rather than hold all these questions to the end, I think it's probably better. So, speaking of boxes, Gillian, you did an amazing trip last year to New York and London. Visited, was it 80 boutique hotels?
Yep.
Stayed in 14 of them.
Yep.
Why? And what did you get out of it?
A couple of reasons. So we were looking at launching a new brand. So I was looking at some concepts that were in existence overseas that aren't in existence here. And the beauty of being a hotelier is that we're pretty open with each other, and when we're not competitive, I had the opportunity to speak to either GMs or owners about what was important in their success and what lessons they learned along the way. And, you know, obviously when you're doing that, New York and London have had a number of hotels built in recent years, and it was worthy of going over and having a look at them. And while you're there, why not look at them all? So that was kind of how I went about it, and it was great. I basically treated it as a study tour for 2 weeks and R&D effectively. And you know, the reality is that Australia is totally underrepresented compared to those two cities anyway in boutique hotels, and I think that that's changed a fair bit in the last 3 or 4 years. But in world-class properties, you know, they're two of the cities that set the benchmark. So yeah.
And which standout hotels? And
well, they're all quite different in their own way. I mean, I went even to something that wasn't boutique, but just a new concept. But Yotel was an interesting concept from particularly a real estate perspective. I mean, it would have to be the most profitable per square metre hotel in the world.
And when you say real estate, what do you mean?
Well, they've got 9 square metre rooms. They've got about, I think they had 750 rooms, and what I could see front of house was 5 staff.
I think everybody just wrote down
charging pretty reasonable rates. So I thought that was interesting. I know one of the speakers is actually the general manager at this hotel, but one of my favourite hotels was One Hotels Central Park. I thought that's. I think we're going to start seeing a few more hotels in that sort of aspect with an eco bent but luxury also. And I thought some of the design was very intelligent, and I really enjoyed that. But to be honest, I like them all. I'd spent a long time researching which ones to go to, and every single one had their interesting aspects to it. I didn't dislike any of them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Angela, you were involved in a design conference, I think, a little while ago, where you had to design or they put out to a panel to design a room, and they'd use psychographics rather than demographics to do that. As a designer, can you explain the difference and maybe did it influence the outcome of that room?
I can. It was actually my former company that I used to work for, Gensler, who were involved. So it was my former team who were involved in the competition. This was at the Sleep event in London last year, and it was a competition that happens every year called the Sleep Set, where they choose 4 groups of designers to design a hotel room based on some theme. This year the theme was psychographics.
And for the people in the audience, what is psychographics?
So psychographics is where it differs from where demographics is about gender and age. Psychographics is about mindset, behaviors, values, really attitudes more so than. So what it's doing is it's answering the why somebody is behaving in a certain way rather than sort of an overarching idea around gender and age. It helps to tap into specific needs, wants, and desires in markets, so specific to guest profiles, for instance, by understanding what the psychographics are, who it is that's going to stay in that hotel, what their behaviors, their attitudes, and their mindsets are, you can then better respond to and anticipate what those guests are going to want and need in your hotel room.
And as a designer, did the hotel room Did it change the approach, or did it change the outcome? for
Yeah,
the design?
that particular group had, they were tapping into a group, we've actually been using them at Scott Carver, the Sinus Institute, which defines, which defines the psychographics based in certain categories. Nike uses this particular company to determine these, these psychographics. The group that they had were called the Digital Avant-Garde, so they were essentially who we'd probably call hipsters. So they were young, they were tech savvy, they were looking for a very collaborative community approach to how they live and work and are. And so what they did was they really challenged the hotel in terms of being a community model, so opening it up to the neighborhood, so it goes beyond just the guests staying there. It's about creating this space and this place for people to come and participate. It's an interesting idea, and in fact, Accor is starting to tap into this. So Accor is, I just read recently that Accor is piloting a program in Paris by which they're calling it Accor Local. So they're becoming an outlet really for the neighborhood. So for instance, if you wanted to have your laundry delivered, your dry cleaning delivered to the hotel and pick it up after work, after the hours of the dry cleaners being open, they're offering that service. So it's this, it's really taking the design and the service of a hotel to the next level and really branching out and opening it up to the community.
Right, okay. And we might come
I
back
think
to...
Ace Hotels has been doing that very successfully for a decade also. Not to the same degree as what Accor's doing now, but I mean at the heart of, say, an Ace or a Hoxton is inviting the local experience in, right? And that provides that living lobby for them.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I mean, Ace London, I'm thinking if anybody's ever been there, there's a long bench and you cannot get a seat.
That's
and I'd say most of those people aren't actually staying in the hotel.
They are locals, and I can attest to that. And the Holborn, Hoxton and Holborn is the same. If you walk in, the general manager in that hotel actually doesn't have an office. He lives in the lobby with everybody else. So he hangs out and he watches how people work, and most of the people in that lobby are there from the local businesses having meetings. They're local, just independent creatives that are working. It's a fabulous, vibey environment. Okay. It's the sort of thing we were trying to capture with U Hotels as well.
Okay, well, we might come back to that one. I don't know. Alicia, I mean, collaboration, it's a really hackneyed phrase that everyone uses, and you know, I hear it every time we start a project is about collaboration. Yeah. And it's usually, it's that collaboration is sort of mentioned at start of projects. How important is collaboration in the true sense for a successful outcome? And if you can point to any projects that maybe from your experience that have benefited from that?
I think collaboration, of course, without it, you just have independent team members working on something that comes together in an awkward kind of way. If you're working together, at least my experience is working with a random group of people that have the same objectives is so much more successful than someone who's just got an idea over here and an idea over here, and they're not coming together. A lot of the projects that I embrace, and I always try to have a collaborative, yes, sometimes individuals don't want to be collaborative per se, but having that vision together, if you, as the designer, understand what the owner wants and how the project is actually going to be operated, I think it has this extreme power that you cannot replicate in any other project if you have that success together. I
mean, you can't force it though, can you?
You can't force it.
We've worked on projects together, you know, all of us have worked on projects where it has worked, I'm sure other people, and it's enjoyable. For everybody, and then there's, unfortunately, the vast majority that are not enjoyable.
Yeah.
Is there any way you can sort of correct that on a project? And if so, who is it that should be championing that?
Yeah, I mean,
maybe all of you can jump in on this.
And I think Howard was saying, you know, what you do is a project is 20% design, 80%. But in so many parts of that, we do a great deal of design. But if we can't work together as a team, then and it is about communicating and doing it together and not being, oh, I'm the designer, I'm just going to do whatever I want. It's about working together and getting the success of a project. I mean...
Yeah, I think it also comes down to knowing your story, understanding what the hotel is all about, what they're trying to achieve, what the owners and operators are trying to achieve, and really crafting that story, understanding what that entire guest experience is meant to be, and everyone having buy-in really towards a successful project.
Yeah.
I mean-
Julian?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a few elements to it. One's the creative side, which is a lot of what we're talking about here. I think there's also the costing side and the implementation side. And so, collaboration, a bit to what you alluded to, can either be fantastic or horrible along the way. And I think that, we've had some projects that have been really easy and some projects that have been harder, some because of the actual site-specific circumstances and others because of the manner in which one has collaborated. I think one of the challenges that everyone on the panel would face is that the more design is inherently going to follow a certain direction, along the way. And the worst case scenario is where, we go and it eventually goes to an owner or something like that, and then the owner's wife turns around and said, I don't like that, and all of a sudden the whole thing is back to square one again along the way, and everyone will have experienced that, which I think that's where collaboration can turn almost toxic, because it's so demoralising, and then you end up having sides almost along the way.
What I think it is more important maybe in the collaboration is to understand who's in charge, or who's in charge, who's the decision maker, who's going to be engaged in this from the start to the very end. I mean, I've been on projects where I sat down with one of the, original ideas persons, and took that all the way to the end, and without that person believing in what they were doing and seeing that vision and sharing it and helping that person see that vision together. It becomes not necessary, I guess, unless you have that together.
I mean, I've seen it with Western Sydney, Daniel Grollo's first project, really as a developer. He's up in Sydney. And we presented 2 prototype rooms, one with a glass wall and one without. And he said, how many of this in the glass wall have been done as a city hotel? And at that time, we said, well, it's been done in resorts. He said, no, in city hotels. Well, it hadn't been at that time. And he said, okay, that's why we presented it. He built 2 prototype rooms, and then as close as we got to it, he didn't believe it would happen, and then walked in and just turned to somebody at Grocon and said, how many of these can we get in? It was as close as he got to sort of saying to us at the time, I think you were right. But he did like the fact that we pushed it, and he put his money where his mouth is and built 2, because he suspected it would be the better one. And that was a collaboration in the end. We had to fight for it, but at least at the end you got a better result, I think.
Yeah, I think if you can present a business case or a reasoning behind why you're trying to do something, if it's going to respond to the needs of the guest, if it's going to help you stay competitive, it's going to help the brand stay relevant. If there's a driving reason behind why you're proposing something, if you're proposing a glass wall because it's cool, that's probably not really going to sell it.
I mean, everyone has to stand up in the room and fight for what they've got. It's not about just being yes people. I think that's what I'm trying to sort of get to, isn't it?
That's it.
There's definitely, I agree with that. And I think sometimes for people like myself who aren't designers, we can't see it as intuitively as everyone else up here can, right? And so prototype rooms can be fantastic in that, where you can actually walk through, pick something up, put it on there, take it off, and, then I can personally visualise it, and you're like, okay. And there are times where you've got to trust the designer, and times where you say, well, we're not going to do that sort of thing along the way.
But I think
Trust yourself, I suppose.
Yeah,
along
and
the
I
way.
think that collaboration starts from the beginning, but goes all the way to the end. And collaboration may happen with not only the owners and your team, whatnot, but it's also the builders. And keeping it, to keep it in this budget that they have, it's a great idea, but unless you can actually build it, then what's the purpose of the idea? So actually working with joiners and manufacturers, et cetera, to make that realization to occur, I think to me is one of the most rewarding things. You walk in, it's like, oh, it is exactly how I thought it was going to be, And
you get buy-in from the joiners.
Yeah.
Which is crucial.
That's what we've been doing of late. In fact, I've got a friend, as a quick anecdote, you know, how it can work, obviously, he's a builder, she's an architect, and she joked and said, you know, I'm going to give him this great building and he's going to tear it to shit, pardon my language, and ruin it. And he said, yeah, but we could never afford half of what she put in it to start off with. And they found a great compromise and it's going to be an amazing spot. But I think that, you know, working together to find solutions with builders that can understand the design and appreciate that and try and work towards that and find creative substitutes where required or whatever it is where they do an amazing job. Yeah.
I've got one for you, Julian. I mean, you're a developer and an operator, which is, you know, in this room is pretty unique. What do you say to the developers and operators in this audience that tend to look at boutique hotels as small rooms, minimal back of house, and maybe something powerful as an interior, and that's about it? What do you say? You know, because there are people that do think it's cheaper to build because they're smaller and less back of house.
Well, I think there's an element of truth in it, to be honest, but I think it can be taken way too far. So, I mean, I sometimes, when I'm educating some owners about something where it's, because I can't just do development overall, and we're talking about different things, and say, look, at the end of the day, boutique hotels were disruptive insofar as, you know, back 25 years ago, it was basically the size of your room equaled your room rate. And that changed dramatically, you know. And so there is an element of truth whereby you can have smaller rooms that have high quality design that people are just as happy to pay a high rate for, sort of thing. So I think there is some element of truth in that. But at the same time, the amount of times that you walk into something where there's zero operational consideration given, and you know, there was a project that I'm involved with where, you know, there was room for something like 8 people to sit in, and I'm like, well, this is a 250 room hotel. You know, we're going to have a few more than 8 people working here. Where do you propose that they're going to actually sit? And you know, housekeeping, you're going to want, you know, efficiencies out of the hotel, and at the moment you've got people walking, you know, from 500 metres away to actually deliver the cutlery as to where that storage is. So storage, whilst it doesn't look as efficient, let me tell you, it's going to save some OPEX down the line. And so I think it's about a conversation along those lines. So I think there's some truth in it, but it can be taken too far.
Right. And you learned some of that from the overseas? Did you crept around back of the house and had a look?
No, well, yeah, I mean, you do it full stop, right? I mean, back of house is obviously so different to what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago at any of the properties, sort of thing, where efficiencies are there. So, no, I think many of the times you learn from mistakes that are made either on your own properties or others where you look at it. And you have more of an intuitive sense of it when you've got to deal with the operational aspects of it day in, day out, you know. So there are many rooms like this that are going to be packed up straight after this and be turned into something else. And, you know, we're an expensive country to do business in. And so you understand that the furniture gets wrecked every time you move it too much, et cetera, and certain things are more. So I think you just have more of an understanding being more operational. And often I'll defer to my team in the business and say, tell me what I'm missing, because they're seeing it even more.
I mean, it's important as designers that people understand that there is a certain operational constraint that needs to be applied. Otherwise, and as designers, you do need some constraints. Otherwise, we're going to push it as far as we can. Yeah, so that communication is very important.
Absolutely. And I think boutique hotels also started out being form over function, for want of a better word, you know, style over substance. And I think that those days are largely gone.
I think the guests are far too savvy for that sort of thing, and there's just baseline, you know, levels of comfort, service, and amenity that need to exist in hotels, regardless of star rating, wherever they fall in the charts. They need to just respond to, you know, good night's sleep. You need to be able to turn your lights off. Even, you know, in the most automated rooms, you need to have that intuitive baseline, you know, within the design, I think, really.
Yeah, there's only so far you can get away from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think as designers, it's one of our biggest challenges, isn't it, to try to introduce something quite unique and something that you don't see everywhere and is controlled completely by the operations, but is realistic in the operations, and finding that balance between it. Yeah. Because and getting feedback from, you know, the operation team is golden. If we don't have it, then how do we design a great space for for, you know, the operations owners to long-term strategy, you know, the cost. You know.
It's also tricky in the instances where we actually don't have operators, and we run into this quite a lot, where we've got hotel projects without operators,
Yeah.
and it's owner-driven, and they're looking for micro hotel rooms or boutique hotels that don't have.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I was probably if the I mean you can do both sides.
Yeah.
So
But I had a
we're probably the
conversation.
same. We you know there are people that come and they've got a great site and they do you know, and there is this fixation on size of room, which I think that's the easy bit, to be
Yeah,
honest. I'm interested if you can draw later the 9 square metre one, because I'm still getting my head around that. But it's that's easy. I think it's some of the other aspects of that operation that you
So I
need to
think
challenge.
The way I normally talk to someone about it, either internally or externally, is saying if you're going to be this efficient, there's a risk. And the risk is that you're actually going to sacrifice $30 in room rate. And if you've got $30 in room rate multiplied by this much, your profit's going to drop by this much. You put a yield on that and your building is worth this much less. So, and that can, you know, really highlight attention. I mean, it came to apparently we were talking about a hotel that was going to have a bottom line of about $5 million, and they were getting fixated with the restaurant and how the restaurant was going to dominate certain spaces. And I said, how much are you getting for lease in the restaurant? I said, $100,000. And I said, so if it was $50,000, you know, there's going to be that. Let me tell you, if you don't do this properly, then there's a good chance that you're going to drop $1 million off your bottom line because you're not going to get the premium in rate that you're looking for. And your whole business case, you'll be handing the cheque back to the bank next year. So think about that when you're thinking about your negotiation on this. And also when you're going for small rooms and you're not looking for any public space or any public amenity at all, consider that people might not want to stay there. And that's a risk. If you're willing to take that risk, that's fine. You know, I'm calling it out that is a risk right now. And it's not to say that it won't work, but you need to be aware of the risks that you are taking along the way. Is that getting to where you?
Yeah, no, I think it. I mean, I think it's been bandied around a lot, boutique hotels and what that means. And you know, we've stayed in ones that work, and there's probably ones that probably don't. So it's just trying to find that balance, I guess.
And there's a real challenge, isn't there, between what's expected of a boutique hotel in Australia to New York to the, you know, somewhere in Europe. And I mean, I would find that quite interesting, the challenges and what you were seeing in your exploring to what actually happens and works here.
I mean, the biggest challenge is wages. I mean, put simply, wages times rates. So there are hotels that I would go into and people would say, oh, that'd be fantastic if we could have a hotel like that here. And I'd say, okay, their average rate's $850 US. Well, there's only one hotel in Australia that is of any size that's doing those sorts of rates. Most are doing, you know, even at the high end, a third of that sort of thing. And by the way, their average wages are £7 or $7 US for casual wait staff. Well, triple that. And then we can start coming back to something that will make sense within an Australian environment.
Yeah, I was going to ask
and
that.
you've got to really
Yeah.
work that.
I mean, because 75% of the market is domestic. So if you are trying to bring, I mean, as designers, we do it. We all do it. You look to Europe mainly and maybe New York, and that's why you went there. So as designers, it's very easy to go and you can look and go, this is fantastic. But when you come to Australia, you know, you have to sort of temper that, or, you know, Australianise it if you like, because of
I
what.
often look at something and say, I think this is global best practice. What can we afford to do in Australia where the rate is going to be realistically around about here? That's going to give a return, and that has an effect on absolutely everything. It has an effect on the manner in which you know, there's a hotel group that, you know, I think is a fantastic hotel group, and they just consistently have probably about 5% of their inventory out of order and being redone. They've got a design team of sort of 10 people that constantly look at every aspect and are reupholstering, redoing everything, all that sort of stuff. I came away and I said, well, they would never work if they weren't operating in the cities that they were in. And we had conversations like that. And the general manager was from Germany, and she said, wouldn't work in Germany either. You know, Berlin just doesn't have these rates. So absolutely, you have to do all of that along the way. And if you take it to a place that has oscillating occupancy, then you have to have the challenge of having casualised workforce and still delivering consistency and excellence in consistency, which adds another layer on top of that too.
Because in a boutique hotel, the staff generally need to be of a level that, you know, because there are less rooms, right? So
without that, you're not at the top echelon without great.
so that would work against casualised labour force, really.
It's harder, right? But you have to find a way, because or else if you run it totally at an international, you know, sort of level, well, that's where, again, you hand the keys back to the bank.
Right. Budget keeps coming in.
It's about trying to find the balance between everything, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's why I think we need. I mean, we're all up here because there's we're all part of the same thing. It's just we're trying to solve the problems from different angles. Angela, often there seems to be a focus sometimes on, you know, guest profile with age brackets as opposed to a multi-generational approach. So that, and particularly in the, you know, we see it sometimes, and this comes back to the sort of demographic-led approach or a sort of an outcome-driven brief.
Right.
You know, in terms of that, I mean, it's going to affect the design outcome. But if you multi-generational, especially in a boutique hotels,
Right.
you know, what's your experience with that? And if, you know, because there's two sides to it. It's going to.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Well, everybody's designing for millennials these days,
Exactly.
right? Which is obviously a demographic as opposed to a psychographic. But that's not to say that there aren't people that go beyond that age bracket, the millennial age bracket, that actually hold those same values and beliefs and behaviors. So, you know, there is some value to designing for that psychographic if it's relevant and appropriate. There's been a recent study where Marriott's doing a beta test for a particular hotel in Charlotte where they actually welcomed millennials and had them, you know, they did all the usual things that everybody else is doing where they took the desk out of the rooms and, you know, we've made a lot of assumptions design-wise around what we think millennials want. We think millennials want to all congregate in the lobbies and we think we can get away with smaller hotel rooms with, you know, great beds and great toiletries, but beyond that, you know, room automation, great beds, great toiletries. They're not bothered by the desk. They don't need a chair. You know, they'll just go down to the lobby and hang out with everybody else. But in fact, millennials are coming back and saying, you know what, we actually want a desk. So, you know, 50% they're finding of millennials are actually coming back saying, we'd like a desk, we'd like to work, we'd like to spread our things out. We don't necessarily want to hang out in the lobbies all the time. So I think we need to understand that. That's not to say there's still not value in having that social aspect to the hotel. I mean, obviously we see that because it's part of that community outreach as well. Every hotel seems to be, the lobby spaces in every hotel, most hotels that you're seeing these days are very much about that multi-flexible space.
We've all been in hotels that can be alienating to certain people, you know, so that people don't feel welcome.
Right.
And if picking up what Julian was saying about sort of the operating side of a hotel in Australia and the high cost of it, surely if we can do our jobs properly, collectively, you should be able to design a cool hotel and still have everybody happy. And it's trying to find how you do that without alienating anybody, making it actually a place that everybody wants to be at.
With U Hotels, we developed two brands, and one was a design-led boutique brand at a 3-star price point. And the way we went about making it feel welcoming is really about crafting the story. So making that hotel relevant to its neighborhood and community. This particular one was open in Rio, and keeping it at a price point that hit the 3-star mark, we used everyday materials in creative ways. So we sourced out local encaustic tiles and used bold patterns to create impact in the guest rooms, super graphics, that sort of thing, to create that impact, but at a, you know, within a restrained budget. We commissioned local graffiti artists, so we captured what was happening outside of the hotel's walls and really brought that into the hotel space. So we commissioned graffiti artists to create murals to help illustrate the story that we were trying to build within the hotel. So really, it went beyond a certain demographic. It would have touched on a certain psychographic, but it was really about becoming this welcoming environment to guests and locals as an extension of that particular neighborhood.
Do you know if it was successful for the locals? Did they embrace it? Or?
Yeah, there's they have seemed to embrace it. There's this really great, we've got this great rooftop pool deck, and that it seems to be quite a great destination. It also, it has one of the only, it's the only hotel in the area which has the view of Sugarloaf Mountain and Christ the Redeemer. So it's got fairly spectacular views. Not to say the design is
I was
obviously
going to
also
say,
the driver.
I was going to say the design's almost irrelevant.
So,
I think so.
That's, just probably should have left that bit out.
so spectacular views, but the design keeps them comfortable and keeps them there.
Alicia, budget. And I can feel Julian stiffening up here because he's going to jump in here. Budget is. It's an aspect of all projects, and we're all involved in that. And we were talking about outside on some of those issues, and it involves everybody in this room in budgets. Given it sometimes, not often, is a source of conflict on a project. Can a collaborative team approach, sort of help align people on that? Because it's a tricky one, because you've got, on one hand, you might have an unrealistic budget, you might have an inflexible designer, you might have both at the same time, which is a disaster.
Yeah.
But, in that, again, coming back to that team approach, is it best to get out early, what's your experience from that? Because it's one that affects all of us.
Well, it's a tough question.
Julian will help.
Yeah. Budget's everywhere, It's like taxes, you have it, It is good and bad in many cases, in my opinion. I think it's really important to design beyond, but be able to produce or to deliver within the budget. So in many of my projects I've worked on, we've always pushed the limits of the budget.
Which I think is you need to. I was told by somebody Rick Wally, actually, he's a very good, he was my mentor. He said, if you design it within yourself and with that budget in mind early, you'll end up with an average result. Yeah. And he's right. So I think your approach is the right approach. You have to push it.
You have to push it, but again, collaboratively, we need to work together to bring it back to what it needs to be. And hopefully it's a push and take for everyone. And yes, there is a number that has to be met in many, probably 90% of the time, but sometimes there is that extra bit you can get, and that's because the developer or the operations see the advantage of it. And as Julian was saying, there might be an advantage. It might be a positive for the business, and being able to embrace all of those options. And I guess it's finding that balance for everything is the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Like I'll always be pushing a budget to the utmost, but ultimately we want a result that is happy for everyone.
Well, it's not going to get built if it.
Exactly.
Somebody will pull the pin and stop.
Yeah.
And I remember John Vanderwall, and I don't know if he's here in the room, but everyone in the industry knows John. But he said, I'd rather spend $10 than $1 if the $10 is going to make me some money, because it's pointless just spending the one.
Yeah.
So it's probably targeting where you spend it.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to that. I mean, an owner will tell you, but at the same time, it's up to us to sort of justify why it's worth doing that.
Yeah, well, certainly if you're looking at life cycle costs or future-proofing the hotel and spending a little more upfront in order to get something long-term down the line, or something that you can adapt and make flexible for changing needs, certainly would present a business case for owners.
There's constantly working with, I was talking to Astor Metal earlier today, talking about a certain way of actually building something to save money, so it's like, I've got this idea. Well, if we change it by 10 mils or 20 mils, we'll save money. So let's work, it's...
I think that's where you were talking about joiners and working. I haven't met a joiner yet I don't like. Because we can go to 4 joiners and they will come up with a different way to do it, and you'll get the same result. But the ones, if you listen, they will tell you very clearly, but if I put a shadow joint in here, and he'll tell Julian, I'll change, it's $30 off, I can save $30 on it. Well,
and it lasts longer.
And so
that's the key, right? So I think there's a few aspects when it comes to budget. First of all, I think owners have to be realistic about budget. I think often we can come in and say, and when I say we, I mean it's not... Well, Josh was just on my last project, and I'm not the owner. I'm not the one writing the checks in that scenario. But there has to be a realism around budget. I was involved in a project recently, and we were speaking about this a bit before, where we put aside a budget when we went out for RFP for a restaurant, And the person who won it came back and said, we're not going to do it if you go at that budget because it's not realistic. And it didn't cost them the job at all. I respected them more because of it, to be perfectly honest. And it's much better, I find, to be open and honest at the start. And then the big thing is if you feel like you're working on the same team. I think that's where, we're talking about collaboration, is where people are becoming puritanical about things that, frankly, they don't need to be, and you don't feel like there's any give whatsoever, and it can become adversarial on both sides, along the way. And I was speaking to someone who has gone out and started their own practice architecturally right now, and I was flabbergasted at her statement was that she came out of a large firm and said, I've realised that clients actually have budgets now. That's my biggest learning going from a large firm to go my own. And I was just like, to me, it's the biggest disconnect that I see constantly that creates angst, is that every designer is taught to do what you just said, design without budget in mind.
No, we didn't say
No,
that.
not without budget.
Sorry, yeah.
We said
And I
push
think-
the boundary.
Pushing the budget. I think when it's a pushing of budget to 30% or something like that, that becomes acceptable because you can legitimately value engineer that. When it goes to 100% where you have to fall in love with the initial and then just start deleting everything out, it becomes incredibly time consuming and creates enormous issues along the way. And I think the best designers are those that think creatively and remember and treat it as their own money. I always tell my hotel GMs, when it comes to CapEx, it's not this phenomenal other area which just has cash growing on trees over here. It's actually out of the same area. CapEx is important, right? And too many hotel general managers treat CapEx as if it's growing on other trees. It's the same thing as if it's your own money as to how you do it. And Mike, we worked on a project together where you did that exceptionally well.
Look, I think there's, I think there's sometimes we say that you have to manage compromise, and compromise and a designer usually it's an oxymoron, but you have to know, pick your battles, and you have to know you can't have it all sometimes. Yeah. It's probably, but it is about trying to understand from an owner's point of view and the developer's point of view and the operator's point of view, what are the key things? And sometimes sometimes I do it, you're not listening as well as you should. But if you do, then I think there's that budget you get there together. But if it's totally unrealistic or we're completely stubborn on our side, then it's never going to go. It needs that.
And I think it's entirely appropriate to dig heels in as a designer and pick your battles and say, no, this is important. And why else did you employ me?
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a bad way, but at the end of the day, we employ designers because they're professionals and great at what they do. And so it's entirely appropriate to say, just trust me on this. This is where the prototype can help too. Yeah. Where you can go, see, I told you so. And you're like, you were 100% right.
Wouldn't you think, hotels have been doing it for so long, building prototypes. You'd think there'd be more industries would do real prototypes, not just a marketing suite, do a proper prototype with everything working. It's money such well spent because at the end of the day, everybody can pull it apart, stain it, do all those things. It just baffles me that more people don't do it.
Yeah.
Oh, gee, it's gone quick. Sorry. Julian, large hotel chains. Do you think they're hampered in rolling out boutique properties compared to, say, I know this is a bit of a loaded question, smaller operators? Because there's got to be pros and cons for both.
Yeah, look, I think that there are certain hotel chains that do it better than others, is my honest truth. And part of that's to do with the DNA of the hotel chain. As a general statement, boutique chains are an oxymoron. Boutique means anti-chain, to start off with, but that can be a bit academic along the way. So I think that some do it better. The ones that do it better tend to come from a luxury background, I think, rather than from a mid-scale background. And I think the challenge normally arises whereby there's something that comes out of, I won't name any city in case it's there, but it comes out of somewhere around the world where there is a design committee that's very relevant for there, but not relevant for other markets, and then that gets put into the other markets, and there's not a degree of flexibility, or there's frankly not the design nous that goes through there. and I think that people that are smaller groups, I mean, think of Timo's groups, Unlisted, for example. I mean, they're all over the world, and each is a very bespoke, incredibly highly designed products, and so they do a great job with it. And part of that is with the team that they have there. I think the question would be how many people in large hotel chains have that capability in a boutique area, and I think not many do. So yes, I think that smaller chains do better and individuals do better in that area when they're good at it, I hasten to add.
Yeah.
And I think that it's possibly done from larger hotel chains. And you look at somewhere like an Andaz, who I think does it very well, for example. But I think they tend to come more out of the luxury space rather than the mid-scale space.
Yeah, it's sort of a Hyatt light, really.
Yeah,
Bit.
funked up. I mean, you look at the guest rooms, they're actually not
Yeah.
dramatically different. It's mainly the public spaces that are
Yeah.
quite different. Yeah. And the architecture.
This, we're probably going to get a wind up very quickly, but I'll finish on this
What
one.
do others think about that? Or you can't really comment, actually, don't worry.
What's that? Go on.
I was going to say, what do you guys think about it, but you probably can't really comment
In what way?
about the question that you just asked.
Oh,
Yeah.
look, I think it's harder for the larger chains, and I've tried to not mention the word brand standard, which I did just then. But I think the smaller operators seem to have a vision and less focused on brand standards, so they have an aspiration, if you like. And I think that's probably the difference for us as designers when you're dealing with a smaller operator.
There's more flexibility. There's less of a hierarchy or a
you seen
chain
what
of command up to approvals.
If you look at what Peng Lo does, he lets them run to a degree, but he's got a vision.
Yeah.
I'll finish on this one. How critical is, this is to everyone, how critical is the sort of location for a boutique hotel? Because some would argue, as interior designers, if we did our job, it's irrelevant where it is.
Well,
And I've got a view, but I'm the moderator.
You mean to the design?
Yeah, well, just to the success of the hotel. Because obviously if it's in a great location, it's going to cost you more. The site's going to cost you more, as opposed to in the boondocks. But,
I mean, I think like the Standard in downtown LA, amazing. The location was scary as whenever it opened. Yet it was this incredible, massive hit that just built sort of downtown LA. I mean, yes, it had lots of other dynamics to it, but I mean, how else could you get such a more successful hotel? I mean, it's a bit like Timo's place as well. There wasn't much around that before it opened. And then, yes, there was other things that were starting to happen as well, but
even the Hoxton, if you look at the Hoxton, I mean, that's a dive. Sorry, I mean, it's very better now, but it's
time.
late at night around there, it's not great.
Shoreditch was a bit
I mean,
dodgy
Ace
at the
is
time.
right on, it's on a busy...
It wasn't though. It was
Yeah.
still pretty cool.
It was
though,
edgy.
Hoxton. Yeah, exactly. It was edgy. It just wasn't as it is now.
Again,
Yeah.
it goes back to psychographics. If you're going after the distributors, the disruptors, those people that are going to influence the next.
So are we saying
large
then,
group
are we
of
saying
people
then
coming to stay in hotels.
the neighbourhood we talk about, curating neighbourhood and everything,
Absolutely.
that's great, but if it's in a location, it doesn't really matter if you get it right.
So
I
I
don't-
think
I
there's...
don't-
there you
well,
go. Yeah.
I mean, that's a bit of a grey area, but I think that if the location has something to offer, if there's something that you can tap into, if there's a buzz about the location, if you're going to,
Yeah.
if you're going to some wasteland where there's absolutely nothing around it and you're going to create this cool hotel, it won't work. But there has to be something that you can latch onto, that you can, it's about crafting that story and really making it a destination.
I was in Shanghai and I had to try and find Peng Lo's Waterhouse. I walked and I walked and I walked and I walked. It's South Bund, if anybody's been there. You just keep walking. And I just kept looking because all I knew it was in this gritty area and it was an old water building. And I found it eventually, and it was a building sites all around. It was really great. And
It's
you walk
kind
in,
of
it's
gritty,
amazing.
though, cool. I mean, every single one that we've just mentioned are up-and-coming destinations, right?
Exactly.
So they're not, as you say, a wasteland, right? They
that's
actually
right.
are, where the artists, where nightlife is, all those sorts of things for each of their respective cities. And so they're becoming cooler. And then some of those hotels, and the only one we haven't mentioned is Ace, who helped define that area, and they're incredibly strong in PR. So I would say that location remains the number one predictor of your success. I think the ones that we've mentioned are more the outliers rather than the norm.
Right.
The other thing that I would say though, but it's still possible if you strike a neighbourhood like that. The other thing I would say though is that it's become almost tautological that boutique hotel equals a local neighbourhood, and I actually think that's becoming old hat and boring. Why could there not be a Moroccan Riad in the right climate in Australia that is a boutique hotel that succeeds? It doesn't have to reflect Surrey Hills or Fitzroy or the city of Melbourne along the way. And I think that in some ways, again, boutique by definition is anti-chain, right? And at some stage, we'll start to see a fight back against that bit where all the chains have come in and said, oh, a boutique hotel is simply a funky-looking place that brings in the local neighbourhood, and all of a sudden catchwords like authentic and stuff like that are going to go out the window because they become, they become the movement, and the movement's become mainstream, and then we're going to shift against that at some stage. And I think we're there now, but
It's
I think
already
that
happening,
will start to happen. I mean, these questions asked on stage overseas, some of the forerunners of boutique hotels would say boutique hotels are dead. I hate that term.
Yeah. Stark says it.
Yeah.
Wind up. Time? Thank you.
Thank you.